My name is Marc Anderson. I'm here to talk to you about moving from SOAP to REST. How many of you use the SPServices library? Cool. Well, then you need to talk about this. So I'm the author of the SPServices library, so believe me, I know what it is that you're doing on some level. So we're gonna talk a little bit about how to start to think about moving forward from SPServices and how you could sort of take some steps to make that easier for yourselves and probably hopefully a little bit lay groundwork that you can take forward for quite some time. So who am I? I'm a consultant. I live in Boston in the US. I have my own little consulting company. I'm old, I've done lots and lots of things I won't bore you with, but I've been an MVP now this is the 5th year, so that's pretty exciting, and I'm very humbled to be among that group. It's a great bunch of people. There's some information on how you can get in touch with me in case you haven't seen me out on the interwebs before. I always forget to put this slide up if I put it at the end of the presentation, so there it is. It'll be in the deck if you want it. So if you've been using SPServices, you've been using SOAP, which is a protocol that helps you move data back and forth from the SharePoint server to the client. You may not care that you're using SOAP. You may not really even know that you're using SOAP, but that's been the transport mechanism that's been helping you out. And I'd been thinking about doing sort of a series of articles over the last year or so about, well, okay, great, but SOAP is deprecated in SharePoint 2013. So, how do we think about moving forward? SOAP isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's an older technology. So what should we think about as we're moving forward? And everyone else seems to be moving to REST as they're building new applications. So I wanted to do a session and some articles and all sorts of things like that to try to help people through this hurdle. So, one question you might ask yourself is, well, why would I want to move from SOAP to REST? SOAP is an older protocol. It was created by Microsoft. Most people don't probably know that. It's an XML-based transport mechanism. It's been around for a very long time in a lot of Microsoft technologies underneath, and it works perfectly well. It's very reliable. It's actually, it works fine. There's nothing wrong with it per se, but it's an older technology, and so a lot of people think that the SOAP payloads, because they're XML, are a bit too big, a little bit too, I hear the word chatty a lot. I think that's the developer's problem, not the protocol's problem. But sometimes people think that you have to make too many calls with SOAP to get the same thing done. REST, on the other hand, is much more of a standard. It's a more well-known standard amongst web developers, while we SharePoint developers have for years been sort of putting our heads in. I actually don't want to include myself in that. And if you use SPServices, you've been way ahead of the curve too. But they haven't been thinking about sort of what's going on in the general web development world. And while everyone was working hard in SharePoint with full trust code and stuff, the rest of the world, the rest of the web development world, was moving toward things like RESTful interfaces. And so there's a lot of talent out there that understands REST backwards and forwards, even though people in the SharePoint space may not be as comfortable with it. So that's another good thing. You have a lot more resources available to you. It follows, at least the flavor that SharePoint uses, follows most OData protocols. It's not totally compliant with the OData standard, but it's getting better. It's getting closer all the time. A year ago, when I first started thinking about this, it was quite far away. So they're rapidly trying to move toward using the OData standards. So that again means that, again, you have a much larger number of people who understand this way of doing things than you would if you stuck with SOAP. It passes back JSON, which is a format that's more modern than XML. It is a bit more compact depending on what you're sending back and forth, not always. So at least it's easier to convert from the transport format into something that you can use in JavaScript, and I'll show you how that works. And then again, like I said, more wide usage. So across SharePoint versions, we have different options. How many of you are on SharePoint 2007? In the US, we still have a lot of people on 2007. Microsoft won't admit it, but they're there. 2010? Okay. So you sort of get to choose depending on what you're doing, but you don't have a lot of options on the REST side. And then in 2013, anyone in 2013 or Office 365, SharePoint 2013, you've got a lot more REST endpoints than you would in 2010. And in Office 365, you're actually getting new REST endpoints and capabilities all the time. So that's really where the cutting edge of the REST development is showing up first, right? So if you're on Office 365, you get to play with the fun stuff. So in SharePoint 2007, we didn't have REST. It wasn't available. So if you're still, no one raised their hand, right? I still do a lot of SharePoint 2007 work. And
I'm on Windows SharePoint Services 3.
73?
No, WSS 3.
Ah, WSS 3. Yes, it feels like it sometimes. Well, it's a platform that works. You know, a lot of people haven't upgraded because it still works for them. You know, it depends on what you want to accomplish. So you're stuck in SOAP. So one of the things that hopefully you can take away from this is, well, if we do think we want to move toward,
that's my job, is to move it on to
yeah,
2013.
okay.
365.
So some things you can do with your code before you even do that migration that will help you out. In 2010, we got, you notice the REST symbol there is a yellow one. We got some REST capabilities, but it was primarily limited to what you could do with lists. There are a couple other capabilities, but it's just not, it wasn't a robust list of endpoints yet. SOAP actually got a few new endpoints in 2010, so they hadn't abandoned it yet. Taxonomy, the taxonomy service was new in 2010. There were a couple others, and I have a chart in the next slide that will show you what those were. And then in SharePoint 2013, we have SOAP is deprecated. In Microsoft parlance, that means maybe we'll turn it off someday, maybe we won't. So we don't actually have any idea, and nobody at Microsoft will tell me either. When does SOAP go away? I know for a fact that things like SharePoint Designer use SOAP under the covers, so you know, it's not as simple, let's just turn it off. And a lot of full trust code out there uses those web services as well. So we'll see how long it lasts, but it's deprecated, so we ought to be thinking about what we're going to do next. The endpoint for SharePoint 2007 was still the old _VTI _bin, which is, anybody, a trivia question, anybody know what VTI is? Yeah, exactly. So the people who made Front Page for Vermeer Technologies in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that was their acronym, right? VTI. So that shows you how old it is. It goes all the way back to the Front Page days. So the endpoint for SharePoint 2013 and Office 365 is _API. So all of the REST services are there. And when SharePoint Online, I wanted to sort of draw a distinction. There's more there for the REST services, and it's always expanding. So you're always going to see some sort of discrepancy between what's on premises and what's on Office 365.
Yeah, the listdata.svc is also still in 2013.
Right.
It confused me trying to figure out if it was deprecated or not.
Right.
The page that I eventually got to was saying that it's not deprecated, and that it's more convenient for doing certain types of list operations than the _API
right.
endpoint. But the metadata is completely different.
Yes, yes. So it's they're always concerned about backward compatibility, as we all should be. So listdata.svc will probably be there for a good long time. That's not deprecated. It's still an endpoint that works, but it's not moving, right? It's staying the way it is. So you'll see that API endpoint starts to get more capabilities, so you probably will want to shift to that. So even there you have a little bit of, well, you know, what do we do next? And then SharePoint 2016, something will be new. We don't know what that is yet. I'm guessing that REST will still be a big part of it. CSOM I don't draw on this picture because I don't care about it. I think REST is the future. You can quote me on that, but no one will tell you whether I'm right or wrong. But I think that REST, because it's an open standard, will be there for quite some time. But somebody will invent something new that we don't know about yet, and eventually we'll have to move to that. So we really want to think about how we can sort of future-proof our code as much as possible. So the SOAP services, and this is way too small for you to see, this is from the SPServices library. So there's a huge coverage in the SOAP services that the REST services actually haven't caught up to yet. You can't do all of these things yet in REST. So you still may want to go back to SOAP every once in a while, depending on what you're trying to do. I think most people are reading and writing from lists the majority of the time when they're using these services. So there they've got you covered quite well. But if you're doing any of the other things that you see on this list, you may end up doing a little bit of both. And then you have CSOM to bring into the mix. So you really have 3 options. So how do we think about converting? So if you've got a bunch of code out there that you've used SPServices for and it works, you don't really want to go and just rewrite it and have it break or have to go through the whole rewrite process. If they're little chunks of code that do minor things, maybe that's not a big deal. If you've built sort of bigger applications or like a single page application. I write single page applications in SharePoint 2007. It's just a web browser. We can do whatever we want, right? We're writing everything client side. So if you've written more robust applications, you may want to start thinking about using some of these approaches to make your code sort of more modern or move it toward REST. The first thing is to abstract your data access calls away from sort of inline code. So if you started out with SPServices and you just started using it the way I did, I mean, I built it based on what I was doing with clients. I ended up with a lot of GetListItems calls and sort of in line with everything else, right? Just like we all sort of started out by putting inline CSS everywhere because we didn't know better, right? So lots of redundant code, lots of, I might make a GetListItems call to a task list 4 times in a given chunk of code for an application. So it's not very efficient. It works. There's no problem with that. But one thing that we might want to do is to start to abstract those calls out. So if we know that we're interacting with a tasks list, and I'll show you an example of this, then let's build some sort of generic functions for us to interact with that task list with the settings the way that we want them so that we can reuse that over and over again, okay? So that's one step. Get familiar with promises. If you're still using the SOAP Web Services synchronously, anybody still doing that? Anybody not know promises? Okay. If you haven't gotten into the sort of using promises and understanding how they work, do that. It doesn't matter whether you're using SPServices or REST or any other protocol. What that does is it starts to make all of your calls asynchronous. You may notice if you're using SPServices with synchronous calls that every time you make a call, if the server is slow, the browser stops. Especially in IE. IE is horrible for that. It just totally blocks the thread. And so your users are sort of sitting there going, well, I can't click on anything. I can't go to another tab, right? You probably noticed that. So if you start to use promises, you're gonna put yourself in a better state for using REST and just general client-side programming anyway, okay? But this is the time to learn that, because if you're gonna go through this conversion process, you want to be moving toward promises as well, okay? I think of promises in a very simple way. We make a call and we know that SPServices will return you a promise, as will many other interfaces, APIs. So we make a call, we get a promise back, and that promise is sort of like an empty envelope. We get an envelope and we sort of look at it and we go, but you didn't give me anything. And SPServices sort of says, don't worry about it. When there's something in there that's really valuable, I'll tap you on the shoulder and let you know. And so you go on and do whatever you want. And you get this little tap on the shoulder that says, data's in there, right? And when you look, oh, lo and behold, there's data in there and you can start to process it. So you can see where you're not blocked waiting, you're not staring into that envelope. If the server is slow, and this could be milliseconds or I've seen it be minutes, which is really, really horrible, but it happens, then you don't want to be blocked by that. So promises are an extremely efficient way to write client-side code, a method to use to write client-side code. Also think about using JSON. How many of you are still parsing that XML apart using, this.attr something or other? Yeah, okay. So you're brute forcing it. That's the way I used to write my code too, because I started doing it that way. In fact, all my examples show you doing that. So, you're not doing anything wrong, but again, you want to start thinking about how can we move toward the future, and I'll show you how that works. There are a couple different layers of abstraction we can take so that we start to move away from XML and toward JSON, from synchronous calls without promises to promises, and really start to make our code work better as well. convert individual calls. So like I said, get list items, update list items, those two workhorses, we have lots of options on the REST side. We can definitely replace those. Some of the more esoteric calls or calls that you're not as comfortable converting, you could just leave alone for a while. You can sort of cherry pick what you want to switch to REST. You don't have to do it all at once. They can absolutely coexist. They're just different languages you're speaking to talk to the server, okay? And then I would suggest always starting new development with REST if you can. You don't have the option on 2007 yet, but when you get there, start with REST. Don't automatically. I mean, one of the nice things about SPServices is that you can just, it works on every version exactly the same way, unless there's an endpoint that didn't exist on an earlier version. So that's actually one of its strengths, I think, is that we can pick up that code that we write in 2007 and drop it in 2013 on Office 365, and it totally works. And it will, I can't guarantee you it'll work, but I'm pretty sure it will. So that's a benefit, but at the same time, I think if you're going to start greenfield development on Office 365 or 2013, you really want to start just writing REST code. I think you'll be better off that way. And then, do you use the word spackle here? It's the stuff that fills holes. If I punch a hole here, I can use spackle to sort of cover it up. So, filler? Polyfiller. Okay. Use polyfiller. I knew that word might cause a problem. Use polyfiller with CSOM or SOAP. Again, I'm not a big believer in CSOM because it's a proprietary standard. It's a SharePoint thing. I think that we're better off using open standards like REST. And then sometimes you're going to fall back to SOAP as well because there may be endpoints or capabilities that just aren't there in those other places yet. So that would be the sort of decision-making process that I would take. Any questions about any of these? Feel free to interrupt me anywhere you want. It's that after lunch nap time, I know. You probably can't see all of this, and that's actually okay. The idea here is when we're abstracting out the data access, what we can do is build a function. So this is a function I took out of an application I built that reads the task list. I use task lists as examples a lot because everyone knows what a task list is, right? And rather than just making this call to SPServices, update list items with some options, I build a big function around it. So I actually end up writing more code, but the big function around it basically takes as an argument a task. I pass a task in, and then what this does is just update that task based on the data that came in, okay? This function has something on, the blue box is the actual work that's going on that you would be doing inline normally. When you call that function, your program, your application doesn't care how you do the work, right? So if you do this abstraction, if this is step one, you're actually not rewriting anything. You're just sort of moving things around a little bit. Hopefully you're comfortable enough with what you're doing that doesn't sound too scary. There are promises built into this, so if you see something that you're in the front row, you can probably read it. So you're still doing the same work that you did before. You're passing in a task instead of sort of doing it in line, and then you're passing back a result as in the form of a promise. So your code can sort of just keep doing the same thing it did. If you were using promises before, this would actually be pretty much the same effect. But this blue box you can replace with whatever you want. You could replace it with CSOM, you could replace it with REST, or protocol number 10, whatever's coming next, right? And it won't matter because you're just calling that function and you're performing the same end result that you wanted. Does that make sense? That's what I'm talking about abstracting out your data access methods. Now, if you're making one of these calls in your entire application, that may not really make a lot of sense, right? You may just want to leave it in line and replace the REST call. But if you're doing something where you're reusing the same kinds of calls to SPServices a lot, this might make good sense to you. And then we just replace those calls when we're ready. So here I'm taking the SPServices call out and I'm replacing it with a REST call. This one's actually just deleting a task. So it's not really doing much data manipulation or anything. So I pass in the ID and I delete the task here in SPServices, or I delete it in REST. No big deal, right? And I pass back a result that's the same regardless of, or success or failure. That's the same regardless of the mechanism I use to do the deletion, okay? So we abstract some things out because we're using those functions a lot separately, and then we can at our leisure, or sort of in a wave or a phase, or however you think about doing your development, make the replacements with the REST services after that, okay? And that way you're replacing one call for another call. It's a little bit less scary. You can do this stuff gradually. You don't have to say, all right, the application's going to be down for, I don't know how you do your development. I know you all use, dev, QA, and production, and everything's perfectly the same, and there's no problem with data differences and all that stuff because you live in perfect worlds, not like mine. But you may have to think about phasing things. Let's just make this part of the ordinary maintenance of what we do, so that you're not rewriting a whole application. And this approach, some of these approaches will help with that.
Can I ask just one question on the code
Yep.
on the right-hand side?
Sure.
Where's it obtain the access token from?
I sort of don't get into that too much. So there's actually a, I skipped that, didn't I? So there's actually a token in the page. I'm drawing a total blank here. It's a hash in the page, so it's actually stored in a JavaScript variable that you can go and parse out of the page. So that line is missing. Thank you for catching me. So it may be a little bit more complicated than this, but it's not a lot more complicated. Okay, it's an example. All right, so actually the stuff on the left isn't showing up, but that's okay. So this is SOAP on the top. This should look familiar to you, right? We're doing an SPServices call here. We're doing a GetListItems. GetListItems is a great example because everybody uses it, right? And down here we have a REST call that does the same thing, okay? So, and I'll get into some more of the exact details of this, but there are pieces of these calls that you're all pretty familiar with, right? I mean, you all love Camel. Everybody's favorite language. It's actually a great language because building it up programmatically is quite easy because of the way it's constructed, the ands and the ors and all that weird stuff that reads very strangely. It actually builds up programmatically really well. So we have some options that we pass in, like camel query, camel view fields. What data do we want? How do we want it returned? How do we want to sort it? Things like that. We can do the same things in REST calls. We just have different verbs and nouns and adjectives that we use to do it, right? So I'm saying, I want to see these, 8 fields or something like that? Well, those 8 fields are here. I go to the endpoint, and I'll get into the more of this detail as we keep going. But I go to this endpoint. I'm saying get the list by title, tasks. I want to see the items, ? So all the options become part of the query string with REST. And I'm saying a $select equals ID, title, assigned to /ID, because I want the ID of that person. I assign to /title, which is their name, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in order to get the things after the slash, I have to do a projection onto the user information list. So that's a nice thing that we can do with REST that we can't do with SOAP. A projection means go look it up based on this ID and give me some stuff from over there, right? So $expand equals assigned to /ID, comma, author /ID, which basically means go and look those two up by ID and bring me back the data that I'm asking for, okay? So we get sort of an implicit join. It's like a join that we can't do in SOAP. And then I can also say $order by equals created descending, just like I do up here in the order by, okay? So these are just different ways of saying the same thing. I think people often get sort of frightened by the fact that they have to learn a new language. But once you've learned French, Italian, and Spanish, English isn't so hard, I guess, except we have weird words, and vice versa. There's some more to this, and I will show it to you as we go along. So some of the mapping here, I don't think you're missing too much off the left. So, you know, how does one part of what you're used to doing in SPServices map to the verbs in the OData calls? So camel view fields is really the select, $select. The query is really the $, filter. I didn't have a filter in that previous one, but you know, if I don't want all of the items, and by some, you know, I only want content type equals whatever, or I only want things where the sales number is larger than 10,000. Filter and order by, those two things are verbs in OData. Limit, $limit says only pass me back a certain number of these items, just like we're used to doing with the row limit. I mean, if you think about it, when you're asking something for data, these are all the common verbs you're using no matter what it is. It's the same as if you're using SQL, right? You have data in a database and you want some back. These are the things you're always going to be specifying. Camel view name, in SOAP we can specify a view name, and REST doesn't really give us that, but I always thought that was a bad idea to do that anyway, because we can have somebody change the view name and then all of a sudden we're not getting the data we want. So that's not so bad. Query options, that lets us do some interesting things like pass back the URLs of attachments instead of just a Boolean and things like that. There's no direct equivalent for these things, but sometimes depending on what you want to do, the OData calls will give you a few options on that as well. And then expand is the sort of the projection idea where we can go and look up data in another list. Okay? Any questions about that table? I've never seen anyone else build this sort of, you know, if you do this in this language and then that in that language, so I thought it would be useful to come up with this as a reference point.
Yes.
Yep.
Is it possible to bring back sort of sets of data, so the first 100 rows, the second 100 rows?
Yes.
It is.
I should have top here. So $limit is only send me 10.
Yes.
Top means from where. So effectively paging.
That's good.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So we can actually do that with GetListItems, but it's a little painful.
It's possible to do with GetList. Well, with SOAP anyway, SPServices.
Yeah. This actually is a better place to go. You will have more capabilities, but you know, it's different. Yeah. Any other questions here? No, I'm only looking at GetListItems here. All of the stuff on the left here is specific to GetListItems. These things are specific to OData. So once you learn what these things mean, you really understand a lot more of REST. The SOAP web services are incredibly inconsistent. You know, the teenage intern who wrote the GetListItems service is a different teenage summer intern than the guy who wrote the permissions one. I mean, they're just vastly different. The way they work is different. The way we pass data in and out is different. I mean, if you've used any of the other web services, the SOAP web services, you've seen that. So we're moving to a much more consistent interface with REST as well. They're actually trying to follow some standards here. With REST, we can also build things like like this is a generic read function that I grabbed from somewhere on the web. I think I have a slide at the end with some references. It's in one of those articles that I highlight that I just keep going back to. They're just helpful articles. So this is like a GetListItems, because we're sort of comfortable with what GetListItems means, right? And we can just pass in the variables. This feels very SPServices-ish, doesn't it? So we pass in some parameters, we make that REST call, we pass back the success or failure, which is the promise, okay? So we can also sort of abstract around REST for something like this in a generic way, which I think is probably a good idea. People keep asking me, when are you going to rewrite SPServices for REST? And I haven't been able to figure out why that would be worthwhile, because REST is quite terse in its vocabulary. But something like this maybe would make sense to include in SPServices, or sliding some of the calls to GetListItems and things like SP Cascade dropdowns as REST underneath. But you know, you don't really see what's going on inside those functions unless you look at the code. So you can also do an abstraction over REST that might be helpful here. That is an easy one to find. In that article, it also gives some examples of update functions. So you can just sort of use those as generic building blocks. There are a couple other things I wanted to highlight on this one. So here what we're saying is we're going to accept in return for this call, we're going to accept JSON, okay? REST will also return XML. If you really want XML, you can have it. But again, this is a time to start moving from XML to JSON and really starting to think differently about that. So if you don't specify JSON, you will get XML back. It's a different format of XML, of course, than GetListItems would pass you back. So you just still have to learn that dialect of XML. The other piece is that this OData equals verbose. We're only going to accept an OData result that is verbose, which means, tell me as much as you possibly can about that data source. When they first came out with this REST endpoint, you had to say OData verbose because it wouldn't work if you didn't. Now you have the option. If you don't specify OData verbose, you get what's called OData light. So you don't get as much metadata about the data. So if you know exactly what you're going to get back, you don't need to get that extra metadata. It's not a huge addition to the payload unless you're getting maybe one item at a time or something. But if you really are trying to cut down on your bandwidth and you know what's going back and forth, you don't need that extra metadata. Okay? Questions about that? Okay, so what does the data coming back look like? Again, sort of hard to see from the back, right? We've got a TV back there just for people sitting in the middle. Okay, so you've probably seen this coming back from GetListItems. This is the XML format that you would normally be used to. This is a task list, so it's actually this is a custom list, like a request for procurement. Okay, so we get back data that all starts with OWS underscore. Anybody who's done this before knows what that looks like. So that's just a plain old 0 item right there. So the sort of middle ground here is to use the function in SPServices called SPGetListItems JSON. Anyone using that one? Okay. So that function basically reads the list schema as well as the data and sort of automatically converts it to JSON for you. Okay, so this is what JSON looks like in your debugging tools in the browser. And you don't have to parse this apart. You use a parse JSON function, which is just one function like that. You don't have to do all of this, .attr OWS underscore blah blah blah, right? So it's just a quicker conversion thing. So if you want to start to learn how JSON works, you can use this function instead of GetListItems, and I'll start handing you, SPServices will start handing you JSON for the same data source. So you can sort of get used to what that data construct looks like. Okay? And then when you start making calls to the REST endpoints, you're going to get JSON back that looks more like this. I wasn't smart enough, or I didn't pay enough attention, or whatever, but my JSON that I hand back from that SPGetListItems JSON function is not quite the same as what the REST endpoint hands you back. So you'll have to make some adjustments in your code, but they're pretty minor things in most cases. It's around users and a couple of the other data types. I actually give you more back with that function in SPServices than you get back from a REST call. So you'll just have to make some adjustments with what you do with the data, but it's not a huge deal. So you get, this is the verbose level. So here we get some metadata. What was the request like? The E tag tells you some things about how many outstanding changes or how many changes have been made, things like that, how many items there are. This is a data type. So if you were to build something automated that we're just going to read all of this stuff generically, you'd want to know what that data type looks like. And then you get metadata about some of the additional fields. Like this requester is one that I used a projection to get the detail on. So I get metadata back about the complex object. which could be useful. And then I get the data, okay? So if you do OData Lite, you won't get a lot of that metadata back. And you can see that it would sort of come with every item, so it can add a little bit to the payload. Okay? So all that's great, but you probably want to see what it really looks like, right? So, get that out of the way. Swap over here. And I always screw this up because of PowerPoint's love of taking over the other screen. Bear with me here. Where's my mouse? This only happens when you're doing a demo. Okay. Good changes. And of course, the resolution is about the same as my kids' toys. All right. So this is an application this is actually a demo application that I put together just over the last couple weeks, and I thought it would be a great one to use to show you how this all works. If you come to my session tomorrow, teaser, this is all done with Knockout. So this is reading several different lists and pulling things together into a common UI to let people manage those procurement requests and tasks and things like that. But that's not the point of what I'm trying to show you with it today. That's nice and big, right? You can see that in the back. All right, so what I've done here is I've done that abstraction of data access functions, okay? So I've got a separate library there called jQuery.clt. This is for the Charlotte Airport in the US, .clt.js. And then I've got an application file, which is not open, called procurement, which actually has the business logic in it. So just one file for the data access stuff, and one file for the business logic. And I'll show the business logic part of it tomorrow. So what I'm doing here, I'm using define.js, but that's also not the point. So if you really just focus in on what I'm doing with a function here, so this is that request list, and I've built a function called readAll, okay? I can pass some options in if I choose to, and like at the top of most SPServices functions, I've got an option object that'll merge whatever options I have built into the function with whatever options you pass in, okay? I create a deferred object. In this case, I've got a camel query that says, let's sort it by create date descending. And then I had an SPServices call. These variables are defined up above. Doesn't really matter what's in them, but you recognize what's going on there, right? So I had an SPServices call that I was making. I was getting data back. Everything was working fine, right? But we're on SharePoint 2013 on Office 365, so I said, well, let's, instead of that, let's convert it to a REST call. So the REST call that does the same thing is right here. And again, the data that it returns is a little bit different, so I had to change some of the code in my application, but not a lot. And you'll see I'm doing a query. I'm building the strings to add to the URL here. So select ID, title, requester, some things about the requester, the department, a link to a contract, which is in a different list, the created date. I'm expanding that requester so I can get the additional data. I'm ordering by created descending. Okay? I pass it into that GetListItems function that I showed you before, and I get back a promise, which I should be. Oh, actually, I'm using a success and failure function here, right? So it passes to one of those two, and then resolves the promise with whatever happens. Okay? So I took that SPServices. First, I did the abstraction, right? I actually used this code from some other application I had built, so I didn't write the function again. I got the read all function. I switched from SPServices to REST. Made a couple of changes in my application code, and everything was good to go. Okay. Now it makes it sound really easy. It's not a 5-minute task, but it's not a 3-hour task or a 2-week task either. okay? You're just getting data back that looks a little bit different, and you have to manage it downstream. Okay? So if I run that in the browser, let me go here. This was all lined up nicely before the resolution changed, of course. So if I go here, I'm just going to refresh the page and stop inside that function, which I call, I think, 2 or 3 times in the application, if I'm not mistaken, or I will. So, so I'm not using this camel query anymore because I'm using this REST call. So I really should have commented that out as well. I build those 2 variables. I call GetListItems. And then at some point, I pass back the promise. At the end, I pass back the promise to the calling function, or calling program, okay? So what happens over on the network side is this call goes out, and you can see that the URL looks like, you know, the URL that you would expect. It's got all that stuff glued together. If I copy it and go and dump it into IE, which just happens to render this stuff a little nicer, I see what the data looks like when it comes back. Okay, so this is the JSON data that's going to come back from that call. I'm not passing a header or anything, so I can't specify any verbose or light options or anything like that. I'm just using the URL. This is the way to test. Okay, so I can see that I've got. Yep. So here's a. I'm trying to see the edges here. So here's an entry. It's easier to do from the screen. Just want to put one at the top of the page. So this is an entire object coming back. So here's a request list item, right? It's got all the data that I've asked for, and it's all just. This is actually coming back as XML, right? Because I can't pass the stuff in the header. But IE shows that to me nicely, so I can see what I'm getting. So once I pass it in the program, I can actually get it back as JSON, and it'll come back in a different method. But at least this shows that I've got the request working correctly. I'm getting the data back that I want. So that's always a good test to do. Is I find that IE shows me the data. It comes back in the more consumable way than other browsers do. I flop between the different browsers all the time because of that sort of stuff. Now, if we wanted to look at what's going on here, when we wanted to call the other way of doing things, I could just take this and do the SPServices call and see what the difference is. But it's going to give me basically the same data coming back, right? Didn't copy all of it. But you get the idea, right? So there's sort of 6 of one, half a dozen of another, a couple of different flavors. And the data comes back, and I can use it in my program, right? So it's really not that different. I mean, it's one of these things where I think, again, a lot of people are sort of intimidated by the conversion concept, but it's really, when you look at the bits and pieces, it's not so bad. Any questions? Okay. Let me run that through. So the other difference is that GetListItems JSON function, the one that's part of SPServices, we actually get back JSON from that looks a little bit different. So this is what I'm passing back from that function. Can you read that in the back? Maybe, sort of. So what we get back there is a change token, because we're using GetListItems since change token changes. It's one of those two. I get the data back. I get how many items were deleted. I get the mapping back. So I'm actually passing you back some metadata that you may not even recognize is there. I'm going through the list schema and figuring out what every type of column actually is. So things like there's the created date. It's a date time column. So I'm passing you back some metadata too that you didn't even really ask for, but I'll reuse that if you make a couple calls to the same function or to the same list. But the thing that we really care about is the data, right? So I'm passing the data back in an array that looks actually fairly similar to what you get back from the REST service. Again, a couple of differences, like around the a person or group column. I actually get more data than you would normally get from your projections in REST. It's just a query option I can specify on the function in SOAP, so why not, right? So those are the sort of subtle differences you'd have to handle in your code. But then if we look at what comes back from the actual REST call, we saw the GetListItems call, we saw the GetListItems JSON call, and then if we just keep running through this, we can see what the actual response is from the REST call. Let me just find it. SharePoint has actually become very chatty. All of these requests it's probably made a whole bunch of requests while I've been sitting here paused. So let me just run through this again so that I can find it. There it is. So there's the REST call. I haven't gotten the response back yet, but I'll play this through. Go back here. Some days I agree with people about who complain about the debugging tools in the browser, especially when everyone's staring at me. So there's the result. That's the JSON that's coming back, and I actually stuck that into the browser earlier just because it's easier to see. Oh, I'm sorry, into my text editor. So it looks like this. So I get a D object back. That's what we get back from JSON, or from REST, using the OData standards. I get a results object, and then I start to get the data back. So this is the first item back from the list. So you can see that, again, it's just different dialects of the same language. Okay? So a couple tricks there that we can use to make things easier on ourselves. We can do some abstractions of the calls. How many of you would find using abstractions like that useful? Is your code sophisticated enough to, that's the wrong word, that's a value judgment. Is it complex enough that you make the same calls in multiple places? Yeah, okay. So some of this is just tricks I've learned as I've written these client-side things over the years. I realized that I've been inefficient, and so these abstractions of data access calls is something that I've learned it makes me better at writing the code, makes it easier because then I can just call that thing and I don't have to copy and paste big chunks of code, which is never a good idea anyway. And then how many of you would want to start replacing the REST or the SOAP calls gradually rather than doing it all at once? Yeah, gradually? Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that trying to do all of this is let's rewrite everything is a much more daunting task than trying to sort of pick it apart into pieces. And that's what I'm trying to convey in these articles. So I'm just curious what you guys were thinking about how you'd attack this.
REST can't do everything anyway as it is, so you don't have an option.
Well, it can't do everything, but it can do the majority of what most people do. So I mean, is anybody using SOAP for things that they don't think REST covers? Yeah, like what?
The only thing I'm doing is I'm trying to update a SharePoint group description.
Yeah.
For some reason it does not work in REST.
Yeah, I don't think that's covered. That service is not very robust yet. I think permissions may be another place where there's not quite as much there. I think they've caught up on taxonomy, I think. Anyone doing any REST calls to taxonomy? No. So it depends on what you're doing. If you're doing something where you're using 3 or 4 or 5 of the different SOAP web services, then you may well run into some operations where you actually can't convert some. But then you can just decide to do that as the capabilities show up.
I guess there's some other considerations as well. XSL gets used a lot with XML payloads, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And it traditionally gets used for building bits of UI and stuff like that.
Right,
So
right.
That's something that's
Are you doing that?
Have done before with, SharePoint, web part development. You tend to, most people, I guess, who've done anything like that have been involved with XSL.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think the holes are being filled there with things like Knockout, Angular. It's a different approach for that transformation, but it gives you a templating option that is analogous to what you're doing with XSL. So and again, that's sort of where the world has gone, while SharePoint people have sat there twiddling their thumbs doing other things. Okay. Let's see. Only got a couple more minutes. Any other questions? Yeah.
Just wanted to comment, if someone was interested, using something like a tool like Fiddler
Yeah.
is very helpful for working with the REST API, because you can test your URIs before you try to debug your scripts.
Yeah, I see people using a bunch of different tools. Fiddler is definitely a favorite one. It does probably way more than what most people actually want. I mean, it's incredibly robust. There's another one I've seen people use, and the name is escaping me, but where it's really built just to handle REST calls. You can sort of fill in a couple fields on a page. I think it's even a web page, and you send the REST call and see what comes back. So you do want to get familiar with some of these additional tools that you may actually find useful even when you're doing SOAP work, because they understand that stuff too. If you've been doing this stuff for a while, you understand what tools are in the browsers. So that part probably doesn't scare you so much. I think people have been doing server-side code and then have to start to move to REST. That's a much bigger mind shift than people have been doing server-side code. I find that I'd use IE, Firefox, and Chrome pretty much interchangeably all day long. You have to test an IE because that's what most end users use, right? I love developers who write everything using Chrome and then wonder why it doesn't work for their users in IE, especially because they're using IE8 or something like that. I find that some of the network stuff, looking what's being passed back and forth in those XHR requests, I find Firebug is a little bit easier for me to work with. We can see that the tools here are here in Chrome as well. I started using Firebug before everyone else started using Chrome, and then when everyone started using Chrome, I knew Firebug, so I stayed there. Then Firebug started to suck a little bit, and I started moving to Chrome. So, each browser has its strengths. Being able to pass the REST calls in the URL is actually sort of nice. Like what I was doing over here in IE, because you can immediately see if you're at least getting a result. If I do something stupid like, I don't know, just add an extra character there, which it'll just break it. So something's wrong. We're used to that with SharePoint, right? An unexpected error just occurred. So at least we can easily tell if we're getting a successful result, and we can sort of work in that URL very quickly until we get to something that works. And just like anything else, it's always better to build up from something very simple to something more complicated, so that you're sort of getting to what you really want to work with. I see so many people asking questions in SPServices discussions where they say, here's this ridiculously huge call that's not working, why not? And I say, well, take all that stuff out and see if it works then. And I never hear anything back. So either they never read the response or that worked. So some of the standard debugging tools that I think actually, or thinking that I think is actually a little less, I see some gray hair in here, so I know that some of you know how to do this stuff. But just understanding how to build up from simple to more complex, as opposed to writing the complex thing and then wondering why it doesn't work. That seems to be a common mistake. With these REST calls, I think you can really get into some, you may end up with very complex URLs in essence, and you'll want to really build up from from something simple to start with. Make sure you're at least hitting the right list. Okay? That's all I had to show you. Hopefully this is helpful. I think my main goal is to just try to make this seem less scary. It's not a bad thing to have to move to REST. I think REST actually gives us some really good downstream capabilities that we'll be happier with. I want to encourage people to stay with the times. We should all be willing to move forward. So there we go. Thanks for coming.